Hi everyone, I'm Jin Bai, a Global Change Fellow at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Joining us today is Dr. Madhusudan Katti, an Associate Professor in the Chancellor's Faculty Excellence Program for Leadership in Public Science and the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resource at North Carolina State University. Welcome. Thanks for joining today. What do you think will be the challenges that cities will face in conserving urban biodiversity in the next 50 years?
Well, we are already in the throes of global climate change, and cities, in some sense, have been harbingers of this because cities have experienced the so-called heat island effect. So, in terms of simply temperatures being higher than what was considered the norm, is something that cities have already experienced. But more importantly, cities are some of the world's most populous and popular cities are in coastal areas. So sea level rise is going to be a huge challenge for a significant number of cities around the world. If you look at projections of sea level rise, so those are definitely huge challenges in terms of the very location and structure of cities. But that's certainly at a structural level a big challenge. The other challenges for cities, I think, are in terms of people moving. So again, climate change has accelerated migrations of people, and it only accelerates the trend towards greater urbanization, in the sense that more people are moving to urban areas. When you get displaced from somewhere, that you generally end up in a city. So that's going to be a challenge as well in terms of how cities can absorb and support more people, and at the same time balance protection of nature and access to nature for all these people who live in urban areas. From a human perspective, comes down to the great inequalities we have in our society in terms of wealth and access. And you see these play out in cities also. So I think the challenge for cities to play a role in biodiversity conservation is in addressing these underlying factors that influence how resources are used, who has access to them, and who gets to decide what element of nature or biodiversity is to be protected and where. And at the same time, from an ecological viewpoint, we also have seen that more and more, quote unquote, native species and also some non-native species have found a way to live in cities. So adaptation to human habitation is becoming more common, or at least we are noticing and studying and understanding it more. So that's going to be that the pace of urban growth, combined with the fact that more species are adapting to cities, can be taken as a positive for potential for coexistence of humans and nature, or it could be a negative if it leads to conflict, especially with carnivores and what are considered pest species by people, and increasing proximity with wildlife that way poses some risks that this last year has highlighted. Those are the primary challenges in terms of conserving nature in the context of urbanization. Is how do you manage density? How do you manage urban growth while protecting elements of nature, both for the benefits that humans get from it and for protection of biodiversity, as well as how to do this equitably in ways that are fair to people and to nature and to other species.
And I think it's also important to have city to acknowledge or value nature in cities that are often underappreciated, that there are high biodiversity in urban areas.
Yes.
Can you give me some examples of your past or ongoing research that related to urban ecology, specifically to the Southeast or North Carolina, and what have you found?
My research has become more conscious of the social and historical factors that shape cities. So we are in what was called, what is the American South, a region that had slavery as a state protected institution. So that has left its stamp on how cities are structured, both in terms of initial growth during the period of slavery, but also subsequently through various ways in which racial segregation continues to play a role. We hear a lot these days, urban ecologists are paying more attention to some of these variables now than they were doing even 10 years ago. And one of the factors that's being addressed these days is the issue of housing policy and discrimination in housing policy, which was also an example of institutional racism in the US, where in a number of cities, including cities in North Carolina, you have these policies that are known as redlining policies, whereby cities were sort of designated as different zones with different degrees of desirability for living, which always had an undercurrent, if not blatantly racist, it often had an undercurrent of racial discrimination. What that resulted in is further segregation, even though slavery was outlawed, and post Jim Crow era, you still had that, and so these kinds of historical factors still leave a signature in the ecosystem that's visible now. So it turns out things like redlining can result in visible differences in canopy cover, which some studies have shown recently have impacts in terms of the urban heat island effect, which is becoming worse with climate change. So when you get these heat waves, areas that were designated as the less desirable areas, which have higher populations of minority communities, Black communities especially, tend to have less tree cover, and that means their exposure to heat is greater. Of course, this is a pattern in the context of redlining and the specific policy here in the US. But I do comparative research across cities and around the world, and you find similar patterns of spatial segregation driven by human sort of divisions, right? Racial divisions, socioeconomic divisions, and so on. So my interest at the moment, with local studies in North Carolina, where we're using the citizen science approaches with the triangle bird count, for example, to document bird diversity, but also to document habitat structure and survey to monitor changes in bird diversity and abundance over time as sort of a basic index of how urbanization is impacting things here. But those sort of approaches and the data can help address these underlying questions of how these historical and socioeconomic cultural forces shape the physical geography of the city. So you can think about the social geography of the city in terms of where you find different kinds of people. So I'm increasingly focusing on how this kind of the social geography of people and how they distribute themselves within a city influences the biogeography of the city in terms of where and how nature is protected or not, or the kinds of nature that people build, the kinds of landscaping they might prefer. I mean, the North American model of suburbs is lawns and trees, but that's not the case everywhere. And cultural changes can happen in terms of these kinds of landscape variables. So I'm interested in how human social interactions and cultural interactions shape the geography of cities, and in turn, then how do bird species and other species map themselves onto this landscape? So how do these interactions shape where you find more bird species, which kind of species of birds you're going to find, and so on. So what we have found so far with using data from the triangle bird count in this area in the research triangle cities is that you can see the effect of segregation, both in terms of bird distribution, but also in terms of how citizen science projects like eBird are conducted. So we are focusing in my lab on both the effects of these kinds of socio ecological and economic forces on functioning of the city, but also in terms of how the science of the urban ecology itself is addressing these interactions. So projects like eBird are very popular in urban areas. You tend to get a lot of eBird lists, checklists submitted. But what research from my lab has found is that there are biases within, reflecting human socioeconomic and racial biases in the eBird data, which results in certain areas being underrepresented in the eBird surveys compared to other areas. So, which also plays into what's been described as the socioeconomic luxury effect. So one of the patterns that you find with birds and with a lot of other biodiversity cities is that there is often a positive correlation between the wealth of a neighborhood and the amount of biodiversity you find there. So wealthier neighborhoods tend to have higher biodiversity. That's not, again, it's not a universal. It depends on the design of the city and where it is. But generally, a lot of cities show this. So this has become the luxury effect has become a term that's used for it, and there are lots of research on that. So what I'm interested in now is going beyond just looking at wealth, but unpacking the socioeconomic and cultural and historical variables that result in that wealth, and that drive these large scale landscape changes.
Yeah, I think that's a very important research area that needs to continue expanding in the field of urban ecology.
Yeah, I think this is where it becomes really clear for me as somebody trained in evolutionary ecology and always focus on conservation. This is where it becomes much clearer that the importance of studying what's often called in wildlife biology as the human dimension. And I think it's not just a dimension anymore in cities, that the humans are driving a lot of what you see. So the human role is very clear, and well, it may not always be clear, but it's very prominent and evident. And understanding how that comes about is crucial to our understanding how other species will respond to the habitat, and therefore how we might manage them, as cities continue to expand. And there is potential, if you, again, thinking about the next 50 years or 100 years, whatever, there's potential for developing this better understanding of how humans and other species coexist in cities, for us to build better cities where there is more room for nature, both for other species to survive, but also for humans to benefit from them. With this increasing urbanization, with more and more people moving to cities, there is also the potential that having large numbers of people in these urban areas might increase some of the efficiencies of natural resource use in cities, which might potentially reduce pressures on the landscape in other places. So trying to understand that dynamic is important. That's where my research is focusing, is how do decisions about land use get made in cities? How are cities being transformed by these human processes in the context of climate change? And how can we use that to design better cities that might allow for more coexistence and reconciliation between humans and nature.
I think those are really thoughtful answers for the interview. And thank you for joining today.